Immediately to my right is Charlotte Wood. Charlotte is the author of 5 novels, including The Children, Animal People, and most recently, The Natural Way of Things, which won the Indie Book of the Year award this year, was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Literary Award, and most importantly, was the winner of this year's Stella Prize. That's all that really counts. Charlotte is also the author of a book of non-fiction called Love and Hunger, and her most recent book is a collection of interviews with writers on their craft called The Writer's Room. And then next to Charlotte on this sofa that we have here is Eimear McBride, whose debut novel, A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, was greeted with rapturous reviews when it was first published and went on to win a number of awards, including the Goldsmiths Prize, the Desmond Elliott Prize, the Kerry Group Irish Fiction Prize, and the Bailey's Prize for Women's Fiction. Her second novel, The Lesser Bohemians, has just been published. So please welcome our panelists. And I'm going to start by asking both the authors if they would give a little summation of their books, which is hard in both cases, and do a short reading to give you a flavour of the books. So, Charlotte, would you start?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming along. My book is about a bunch of young women who wake up from a sort of drugged state and find themselves imprisoned in an abandoned sheep station or something. They don't know where they are, in the middle of Australia, in the middle of nowhere. And they don't know each other, and they don't know why they're there. But they fairly quickly understand that the thing that they have in common is that they've each been involved in some sort of sexual scandal, in inverted commas, with a powerful man or men, different scenarios. And they've been an organisation called Hardings International has dumped them in this place, and they're there with 2 male guards and a female nurse, in inverted commas. We quickly find out that she has no nursing qualifications, and in fact she just used to work in a hot bread shop. And I suppose, the question implicit at the very beginning is, are these girls going to get out of this place? And why are they there, and how are they going to survive? And the 2 main characters are a couple of girls called Yolanda and Verla. And they're very different from each other, but through the novel, they become very close friends. So I'll just read the very beginning. So there were kookaburras here. This was the first thing Yolanda knew in the dark morning. Well, that, and where's my durries? 2 birds breaking out in that loose, sharp cackle, a bird call before the sun was up, loud and lunatic. She got out of the bed and felt gritty boards beneath her feet. There was the coarse, unfamiliar fabric of a nightdress on her skin. Who had put this on her? She stepped across the dry wooden floorboards and stood, craning her neck to see through the high, narrow space of a small window. The 2 streetlights she had seen in her dream turned out to be 2 enormous stars in a deep blue sky. The kookaburras dazzled the darkness with their horrible noise. Later, there would be other birds. Sometimes she would ask about them, but questions made people suspicious and they wouldn't answer her. She would begin to make up her own names for the birds. The waterfall birds, whose calls fell tumbling, and the squeakers, the tiny darting grey ones. Who would have known there could be so many birds in the middle of absolutely fucking nowhere? But that would all come later. Here, on this first morning, before everything began, she stared up at the sky as the blue night lightened and listened to the kookaburras and thought, oh yes, you are right. She had been delivered to an asylum. She groped her way along the walls to a door, but there was no handle. She felt at its edge with her fingernails, locked. She climbed back into the bed and pulled the sheet and blanket up to her neck. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps she was mad, and all would be well. She knew she was not mad, but all lunatics thought that. Thank you.
So, Charlotte, I know, and I've heard you say that some of the inspiration from this novel is actually based, believe it or not, on a real place, a real institution, a real prison for girls that existed, I think, in the 1970s or earlier. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. It was. I heard a documentary on good old beloved Radio National about a place, a very brutal prison for young women that was operating in the 60s and 70s in New South Wales, in a town called Hay, and it was called the Hay Institution for Girls. And it was an offshoot of the Parramatta Girls' Home. I don't know if any of you have heard of that. It was a home for, wayward girls and young women who had somehow, again in inverted commas, got themselves into trouble sexually. And often, I've since discovered, by the way, since the book has come out, that these prisons were all over this country, and I'm sure all over
Yes.
Ireland and England and everywhere, that places that girls were sent if they told about things that had happened to them. And quite a lot of the young women in these places were there because they had been sexually assaulted or molested in some way, or, a 13-year-old girl might tell someone that she'd been raped by her father. And the response of our culture was then to charge her at the police station with being exposed to moral danger. It's insane, it's mad, and lock her up. And Hay was a place that 10 girls in New South Wales were taken, who were officially named the 10 worst girls in the state. And they were they were drugged and put on a train and taken out to this place that had been a prison, a 19th century prison for adult men. But it had been decommissioned on the grounds that it was inhumane to keep men in there. But merrily opened up and put these girls in there, and they were just locked away and brutalised beyond belief. The official punishments included they had to march everywhere, they had to look at the floor at all times, they were never allowed to be, certainly never this close to one of their inmate other girls. They had to be a certain distance so they couldn't form friendships or speak to each other. They had to do mad things like build a crazy paving path to, the superintendent's office and then smash it all up again. So psychological torture and all of that stuff. And then, of course, all the unofficial, sadistic, sexual abuse that we're now hearing about in the Royal Commissions. But so that sparked my rage. And I started thinking about how to... The thing that struck me was that it was the fact that they spoke that landed them in this place, and if they had just shut their mouths, they would have been left alone. But speaking was the crime, and so they had to be punished. And then I started to think about how that attitude is not finished. And I started writing it set in the past, but it wasn't working. And then I kept on, little light bulbs were going off around me in our culture about women being punished for things that have been done to them sexually. And, this week or the last week when we saw the porn ring of images of schoolgirls, who gets hauled up in front of their headmistresses and headmasters? The girls, for sending around nude photos. I haven't heard of boys' schools giving hell to all the students at their schools about this, but the girls are the ones getting in trouble again. So that's the sort of thing that made me want to attack this from a contemporary point of view.
So the sense that the silencing and sort of slut-shaming is ongoing. It doesn't matter, we've had a female Prime Minister, we've had a female Governor-General, but these are universal, ongoing misogyny within society, which is a great place to move across.
Excellent way to segue.
And more, I guess, well, tell us about your book. I mean, again, it has the same themes of young women being oppressed for displaying their sexuality.
Yeah, well, A Girl is a Half-Woman Thing is set in Ireland in the 80s, and it is about the relationship between a girl and her brother who, as a result of a childhood brain tumour, is left with some learning difficulties. when she's 13, she's raped by her uncle. And the book then is really about how she deals with both of those difficulties, what she does to herself, the fact that she's kind of alone within the society, within her family, with what's happened to her, and what she does to herself as a way of trying to regain control over her own body, I suppose. So shall I? I'll read
to
a
give
little
a real
bit.
flavour, you need to hear it.
I'm going to read a little bit from the middle of the book. There's a point where the girl goes off to university and she's trying to make a life for herself away from her family. I met a man. I let him throw me round the bed and smoked me, spliffs, and choked my neck until I said I was dead. I met a man who took me for walks, long ones in the country. I offer up in the hedge. I met a man, I met with her, she and me and his friend, to bars at night and drink champagne and bought me chips at every tea time. I met a man with condoms in his pockets. Don't use them. He loves children in his heart. No. I met a man who knew me once, who saw me around when I was a child, who said, "You're a fine-looking woman now," who said, "Come back, marry me, live on my farm." No. I met a man who was a priest. I didn't. I did. Just as well as many another one would. I met a man who said he'd pay me by the month, who said he'd keep me up in style and I'd be waiting when he arrived. No, is what I say. I met a man who hit me a smack. I met a man who cracked my arm. I met a man who said, "What are you doing out so late at night?" I met a man, and wash my mouth out with soap. I wish I could, that I did then. I met a man, a stupid thing. I met a man, should have turned on my heel, I thought. I didn't know to think. I didn't even know to speak. I met a man, I kept on walking. I met a man, and I lay down and slapped and cried and whined and dined. I met a man and many more, and I didn't know you at all.
So, to state the obvious, one of the most distinctive things about your book is obviously the language in which it is written. And I've heard you say in an interview that you're trying to depict the moment before language becomes formatted thought. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that, and also whether the language was there right from the start, whether you couldn't write the story until you'd found the language, or whether you had the story, but
yeah.
I mean, which came
No,
first?
they both came at the same time. I sat down with a completely different idea for the book, and because I already knew what it was, it didn't work at all. And so I had to start from the beginning. And really it was a matter of following the language, and the language then sort of pointing where I had to go with the logic of the story, and trying to, keep that connection quite tight. And I suppose I was interested in trying to make language work in a different way, to see, because I was interested in modernism and the idea of changing the way that the reader experiences the book, of trying to make that experience as close to them as possible. And I wanted to know if it was possible to make reading a physical experience. And I knew that to do that, language had to work in a very different kind of way. And that, that sort of formal language of perfect sentences and grammar wasn't going to be able to do that. And so it was about breaking it down and roughing it up and just trying to capture those parts of life that get destroyed once you experience them. But once you start to describe them, the language that you have available to you is so limited and so generic that you kind of lose what's personal about those experiences once they come out. So really trying to make language catch all those extra parts of life.
And you trained as an actor, is that right? And
That
I think
is correct.
The method acting
that's right.
mode was useful to you. So when you wrote the book, were you always reading it aloud? Like, was it something you actually had to voice out loud to see if it was working?
Yeah, I read aloud a lot of the time, and certainly that acting training was a big part of it, because I didn't come from any kind of academic background or writing background, and so when I sat down to write the book, all I knew was how to make people. And the way that I knew to do it was, this method training about trying to capture all these various aspects of life and make the body express them at one time. And it was trying to just make language do that instead of the body.
Like Charlotte's book, I would argue, it's an explicitly feminist book. Was that something, again, that you were aware ahead of time, that you wanted to write about gender and power and female powerlessness? And I've also, just to follow up from that, heard that you've described it, that it said it's not post-feminist in any way. Could you sort of elaborate?
No, well, I mean, I didn't set out to write the book that I wrote. I didn't know how angry I was about the subject matter until I was writing it. I didn't know that it meant that much to me. It was something that I discovered along the way. And, I'm sort of against describing myself as post anything. I'm a kind of a Luddite. I'm in it and I mean it, and I'm not clever enough to look back at it and shrug my shoulders yet. I'm an angry woman that's still feminist.
And in the sense that, in no ways does it feel in this book that her sexuality is ever really something that she can make a positive thing from? Do you think that's fair to say?
I think, no. I mean, I'm all for her, I have to say. I think
So she's not a victim?
She's not a victim. And the whole point about the book is that she is always trying to become. She is always trying to take control of the situation. The tools that she has to deal with life are damaged by the experiences that she's had, but she is not someone who is waiting to be battered about by the men in her life. She is someone who is trying to take control, and a lot of the choices she makes end up being self-destructive, but that's a result of what she's working with. But she is someone who is active within her life, who is trying to take control of the situation.
Would you, Charlotte, suggest from her book that things haven't really got much better for girls since the Hay Institution? Would you argue that this is set in the 1980s in Ireland, although it doesn't actually at any point sort of name a time or exact place? Do you think things have improved?
I think that there is a potential for things to improve because there is now a way for women to speak about the experiences that they have. When I was growing up, that was not the case. It was very much don't speak, whatever you do, whatever happens, don't say. And you will be blamed if you do. You will be the one who bears the responsibility. And that is different now. That is different in Ireland, where there are so many things that have come out, so many shameful things have had to be admitted to by institutions in the country, that there is no going back on that. And that's not to say that terrible things still don't happen, but there is at least an opportunity for people to do something about them now.
So you've both sort of said that you didn't know exactly the kind of book you were going to write when you sat down to write it, and then you were sort of assaulted by all these other images, all these ongoing questions. So for Charlotte, I mean, it feels like a book that it does feel like kind of quite filled with rage and anger, and they both feel like they emerged, terrible pun, fully formed, but I'm sure yours didn't take... I think you took 6 months to write your book.
6 months to write, girl, yeah.
That is fully formed. Charlotte, how long did it take, and how do you keep going writing a really dark book, and how do you switch off from the images you're creating on the screen or the page?
It took around about 3 years. And I just was nodding along with you, Eimear, when you said you didn't know the anger that you had until you were writing it, and I felt exactly the same way. And it's sort of... I mean, I sort of hate being described as an angry book. It is and it isn't. I mean, I think it's about the control of the anger. And the best phrase I've heard used for this sort of fury is, I think, an American feminist called Patricia Williams, I think, who Gloria Steinem has quoted, and she talked about using the gift of intelligent rage. And I thought, I like that. But I do think part of my anxiety about that is to do with having been brought up in a culture that says women are not allowed to be angry. And I think we often, when we feel that sort of deep rage about injustice, I think we don't really know what to do with that. And it's frightening to have those feelings. for some of us. But so I was, for ages, trying not to write the sort of book that I was writing. I kept trying to make it nicer because I'm nice, and and I found it very difficult until I finally just surrendered to it and thought, well, it's got to be this kind of book. I think a book, I don't know if you feel the same, Eimear. I think if you listen properly, a book tells you how to write it. And once I properly listened, I just then let it all just come out. And then I was like, holy shit. And, I talked to my really nice husband as I was going about, and I'd say, so do you want to know what I wrote today? And he's like, holy moly. But being in it was difficult. I don't want to make too much of that, but, when you're fully imagining the sorts of things that you've written about and the sorts of things that I've written about, if you are fully imagining it as deeply as you can, it has to affect you, I think, in some ways. And I found it easy to come out of every day. I found it hard to go back into. But I also thought, well, it's art. That's what makes it bearable, is making it into a work of art, and a work of art that has beauty and power and something to say and a shape and a form and a story. I wanted to write a kind of gripping page-turner, which I'd never really done before. So those things make the material manageable, yeah.
And one of the redemptive or the beautiful parts of the book is the description of the landscape and nature, and is actually brings solace to the two central characters, most definitely. You never name the time, again, where exactly it's set, what exactly the time period is, but in your head you have a very vivid sense of the landscape where the book is set, and does, I guess, the bush give you solace, and did much of it get written in a similar setting?
Some of it was written in a similar setting. I am quite romantic about landscape. I do find nature restorative and redemptive. But the original setting of it in the middle of nowhere came about because of the Hay. Hay is a town, and the prison was in the middle of the town, and the people in Hay heard the screams at night from the prison, but they were just those girls, so they would scream like that. But I needed, for narrative purposes, to have a much more isolated place. So that, is where the real world thing then fed into making the place that I had. I wrote bits of it in different places. I wrote a lot of it in Sydney, but I did spend quite a bit of time at a friend's farm out in the central west of New South Wales, and that was great to be there with, the grasshoppers spangling up in the heat and the cicadas and that sort of sensory stuff. But also it was useful narratively for my girls to, when they get there, they think they've landed on the moon. They're like, is this the outback? What is the outback anyway? Like, who's ever been there or knows anything about it? And then gradually, because they're just in there, they've got nowhere to go, they start to respond to the landscape, and it starts to speak to them in different ways.
And for you, Eimear, was it very deliberate, again, to not name a specific town or place, or even, as you said, you've told us it's sometime in the 80s, but was that to give it a more universalized story that it could resonate in many different places and times?
It was, but it was also about trying to close down the distance between the character and the reader. Because, I think as I often say, if I say, I'm Eimear McBride and I'm 40 years old and I live in Norwich and I have a red car, then you know that you are not Eimear McBride, that you do not live in Norwich, you are not 40, and so all the detail creates a distance between the character and the reader, and it becomes much more voyeuristic. You're then looking at this person, and what I wanted was for the reader to feel as though they were that person, and that was what was happening to that person and to their body was happening to them. And so taking out all the detail was a way I thought of achieving that.
And is that also a reason why you never name the narrator, a girl, which is
Yeah.
a rod for your own back in some ways, especially when reviewers are trying to say, and the girl.
I know.
Was that very deliberate by the...
Yeah, absolutely. But also it's because the book is about, becoming, and it's very deliberately called A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, because a woman is fully formed. And it's about her efforts to become fully formed. And, that is not achieved, shall we say. And so the name is never arrived at.
Yeah. So at what stage in the process did you have your title? I wanted to ask you both about your titles, because they're both these lovely phrases.
Yeah. Quite early on. I couldn't really think of anything, and I was actually having a conversation with my husband about the book, and I said, because, A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, he went, oh, call it that. And I went, oh, no, that's a terrible title. I won't call it that. That's really cumbersome and long, and it doesn't scan. But it just sort of stuck, and then it stuck, and that was it.
And what about you, Charlotte, The Natural Way of Things? When did you stumble across that?
Well, I didn't. My publisher did.
Credit.
It is a line from the book. I had all these really shocking titles, terrible titles. No, I'd never
People
tell
pay
you.
good
Never.
money, give them
Never,
some
never.
exclusive.
I'll give you your money back. No, I can't. But it was, I find titles incredibly hard because everything I thought of was just some literal, lumpy, heavy-handed thing. Anyway, Jane Palfreyman, the wonderful publisher of my book, just sort of selected it, pulled it out of a section. There is a sort of moment in the book where the voice steps out of itself in a way. So normally, most of it's told through the eyes of either Verla or Yolanda, and then occasionally what I thought of as a sort of aerial voice looking down on them all. But there's one section that sort of comments saying, what would people in their old lives be saying about these girls? Are they being missed? Are there Facebook groups trying to find them? Or are they just vanished and nobody cares about them? And I can't remember now, but it's talking about the language used about women when they suffer things, and the passive voice that's used. So in the way that we say, a woman was killed, a girl has been raped. We don't say a man raped a girl, a man killed a woman. And I've said it's as if, by the very nature of being female, they draw this stuff to them, and as if it's the natural way of things. So Jane found that, and at first I thought it was too long and it's too weird, and I had all these sort of rules about what titles should be, and this completely contravened all my rules. And then I just really loved it, and its openness, and also because it's reflecting the landscape stuff, the nature of the place, and so yes, thank you, Jane.
It is a perfect title. I want to return to something you said, Eimear, which you said that you want people to not feel that distance at all between the character. Mm-hmm. So how do you feel that men feel reading your book then? Do you think they feel implicated on the male characters, or
No,
I just think all the responses
I mean,
you've had?
I think one of the greatest compliments I had was a teenage boy came up to me and said that he completely identified with the character and felt that was him, and how strange that experience was. But no, I mean, I think men have a bit of a bad time in A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, so I would be concerned should there be any men who identified with the male characters.
Especially with saying uncle or...
Yeah.
But that's what your hope reading is, isn't it?
Yeah.
That as I read, I am the person in the book.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
to understand the thing I am not.
Yeah.
What have male readers' responses been to this book?
I'm sure there are a lot of male responses.
There's a great one, if you'll let me to read. What did Malcolm Knox say?
Oh, Malcolm. Oh, Malcolm, he's a dear.
Maybe it's not in this one, but he said that he felt... What did he say? He said he felt quite confronted all the way through.
Yeah, well...
Yeah.
He should.
As a man to read it, is as unsettling as receiving one piece of bad news after another. But you've actually had a lot of male readers, haven't you? Write to you.
Yeah, I mean that was a compliment, right?
Yes.
He then said some other nice stuff. I've actually had more male readers contact me about this book than I've had about any of my other books, some of which have had male main characters who are, nice people. And the response to this from men really astounded me, that so many have written to me saying how much they love it, how powerful they found it, how they think it's important, how they want their sons to read it. So I've been very moved by that, actually. I mean, I'm sure there's millions of men who hate it, but they don't tell me about it.
Oh,
so that's nice.
And I actually, that was not meant to be a simplistic dichotomous question at all, because I also want to point out that both your books, and maybe you can address this, also show something we could call it internalized misogyny, but also that women don't band together. I mean, for a start, we have 10 women, 2 guards, and Nancy the nurse with her nursing hat, but having worked in a bread shop, who if they just rose up could probably, but they don't. The whole point in The Natural Way of Things is how complicated things are and how the women do not form a feminist utopia, far from it. Can you talk a little about that, and then also about women's complicity in your book?
Yeah, I didn't want to, I didn't set out to write any kind of book, but I knew that I didn't want to write a good feminist novel where the men were all bad and the women were all good, or strong or whatever. And also I just thought the reality of being thrown together in a place with a bunch of strangers is, it's highly unlikely that you're all going to get along, And then I thought, we've all been at school, we've all been, on a bus tour full of people we can't stand or whatever. So that the idea of having 10 young women in this place who would, and certainly young women who don't see themselves as feminists or anything of that, they wouldn't even, it doesn't enter their head. They just want to get out and they want to survive, and they want to survive in whatever way they can while they're there, and some of those ways are by elbowing the other ones out of the way, or even, more active sort of sabotaging of each other. But also, they all have been walking around the world feeling that I am an individual person and I'm a self of my own kind. And one of the tragedies of a place like Hay and the place in my book is that they are all told, you are not an individual self, you are all the same thing, and that thing is a slut. And therefore their behaviour with each other is also a form of self-assertion. That they're saying, well, I'm different from you. And they certainly feel, some of them, that, I know that Verla, who's quite well educated, and she has an affair with a politician and she's completely up for it. It's absolutely consensual. She's in love with him, he's in love with her. So she feels like, what am I doing here? These girls they've all been screwed over, but I'm different from them. And then some of the others will think, well, I'm being brought here unlawfully, but she sort of brought it on herself, So, and I think that's just real. That's the way we do think about, with, these girls with the nude photos. I thought of my nieces, and my own response was, oh, I really hope they're not doing that. And then, and I'm sure there's a lot of discussion going on in those schools between the girls of whose fault is what, Yeah. So I think it would be untrue to suggest that in this situation everybody bands together, and also we know from, I think Alice Pung talked about her father being in a Khmer Rouge camp run, I think thousands of prisoners in a place run by something like
a handful
10, 18-year-old boys. And she said, they just didn't rise up. There's something about being captive that makes you captive. And so that's another reason why my girls spend a lot of energy trying to get out, but in their own individual ways that never works with each other.
And the same in your book, the mother is hardly the saviour of the daughter, is she?
No, not at all. And I think there is a lot of internalized self-hatred in women. And I think that women are brought up to assume that they will, that they are to blame for the things that happen to them and to their bodies. And, and I think in the way that, when men feel anger, they express anger. When women feel anger, they feel guilty, and they turn it in on themselves. And I think certainly in the society that I grew up in, that was very conservative and religious, one of the great triumphs of the Catholic Church was that it taught women to devour themselves. And to turn their anger up in on themselves and on each other. And so, the girl in the book is trying to break out of all of those molds, and her mother is not helping her in any way and blames her for everything, and she's just sort of banging her head against the wall over and over and over, and there is no care and there is no concern, and because, that's how she was reared, that's what she lived with. I did it, now you suck it up too,
Yeah, and that's incredibly powerful in the book. I keep thinking, can't the mother help her? Can't she see? Can't she? It really does make you look at yourself and think, how do we reproduce these behaviours across generations? So I'd like to talk a little bit about prizes, because both of you have won a number of prizes with these books. And I wanted to ask, are prizes important to you, and in what ways? And I know, maybe I'll start with Charlotte. I know you have a view that, such a lottery, what can you do? But is it nice to be recognised?
Of course, it's lovely to be recognised. There is a conversation to be had about prize culture, I think, in literature. I'm not sure today's the day for me to have that.
Fair enough.
But and it's the experience of prizes is very different when you've won a prize than when you haven't won a prize, and so it's complicated. And of course, winning the Stella Prize was incredible. It's wonderful to be recognised. And yet, I said in my speech at the Stella Prize that prizes are not the measure of books' quality. They're just not. And we don't know which books of our time will be the ones in 100 years that are remembered. And I know that many of my absolute favourite books in the contemporary literary world have never won prizes. So I think they're a wonderful thing in many ways. It's a mistake to think that they are a determiner of quality.
Of true value, yeah.
And I just hate the idea that writers who don't win prizes might feel that, well, that means that, your book is the same the day before it wins the prize as it is the day after it wins the prize, but the book hasn't changed. What's changed is the conversation about it. And some of that conversation is fantastic for writers. And some of it is not so fantastic.
I would like to think, and Eimear, maybe you can address this, that for these books, which are actually quite dark, complex, you're told difficult, the prizes at least bring exposure and actually sort of challenge people to actually make an attempt, to seek them out. And
I think for me, winning the prizes changed everything. It was, obviously lovely, win a prize, put the check in the bank, that's all good. But actually, what was more important was that they gave the book a life that it could not possibly have had otherwise. It drew attention to it in a way that people took a chance on it that probably would have read a review and just thought, Jesus, Mary Joseph, that sounds desperate. And I think they took a chance because it won a prize, which is a bit galling, but also great, because you want people to take a chance. And then when they read it and they like it, then they're going to take a chance again on someone else in another circumstance. So it was very important for me. It just changed the life that book could have had. There's no question about that. But again, I was lucky. I won a lot of prizes, and I think I just had all the right judges at all the right times. I was someone who had been incredibly unlucky when it came to getting published, but when it came out, it was very lucky. And it's important to remember that prizes are. It's just the opinion of people and who shouts loudest in the judging room, I think, in the end of the day. So
throws their weight around. So you've also both won gender-specific prizes. You've both won prizes specifically for women's writing, without you having to say again how much you love the Stella Prize. Have you? Oh, shucks. I mean, Stella has identified a number of areas of unconscious bias, gender bias in the literary world in terms of, we've done statistics on prizes, on who gets the reviews, who gets the longest reviews, who gets the most attention on school curricula. But do you personally feel like you've experienced any unconscious gender bias in the literary world in the way, say, your books have been received, or in the way the media treats you, the kind of interview questions you might get that others don't? Do you have...
I think I have been quite lucky because I think modernism is traditionally seen as a bit of a boys' club. And so I was kind of honorably accepted into the male club, and was reviewed by a lot of male reviewers and got a lot of big reviews, and was taken very seriously because it was seen as, important, serious man business. And so I had a pretty good time, but I have seen other women and wonderful writers have to put up with a whole load of crap. And I do get asked things like, and how do you cope with family life? And I don't remember the last time I saw, Philip Roth being asked a question like that. No one cares. No one asks men that. Whereas, obviously, writing books and going on book tours is a dereliction of my maternal duty.
Definitely.
May be the case, but isn't really anyone's business to ask.
But your daughter's in the car with the window open, so
it's okay. I left a bottle of water in there. It's fine.
I know Eleanor Catton, when she won the Bailey's Prize, said that women are often asked how they feel, not what they think about winning. So how do you feel about winning this prize?
Yeah. And I think I'm not sure if it's still the case here, but I used to notice it a lot. They would be asked, are you surprised?
Yes.
Do you feel that you've been really lucky?
Yeah.
That
You
a man
didn't
would
expect
not.
this.
And of course, I do feel surprised and I do feel lucky. But they wouldn't probably ask Richard Flanagan.
I know when
do you
Carrie...
feel lucky too?
Yeah, I think there is a sort of a performance of surprise that is
And
sort of
modesty
expected.
that's required.
Yeah. Well, they just go, I am so good, and this book is great, and it well deserved it, And men can get away with that kind of thing,
Yeah. I just was going to say, when Carrie Tiffany won the first Stella Prize in 2013, one of the articles was headed something like, Melton Mum wins Women's Prize. And we were all laughing in the Stella office saying, you'd never see Frio Dad of 4 wins, which is Tim Winton.
Yeah.
Frio Dad wins.
I don't have children, and I think in lots of ways I have escaped a whole lot of that sort of stuff because I'm mannish enough not to have children. And I do think, I see women all the time, friends of mine, being asked all the time about how having children has changed their work or whatever. I mean, and in the writer's room interviews that I did, I deliberately never asked women about that, but I asked the men. And it was and it was interesting because some of them really wanted to talk about it. Like I asked James Bradley, how has having children changed your writing life? And he said, it's completely destroyed it. And then went on to,
Whereas a woman wouldn't be able to say that.
I don't think so.
Well, I would like to talk about, we started a bit late, so we will start questions a little bit later, but I just want to talk about both your newer books, because as we had a little chat at the beginning, both these authors have talked about these books, these wonderful winning books, a lot. So, Charlotte, since you mentioned the writer's room...
How was that?
What were the most surprising things you learnt when you were doing? I mean, was there anything where someone told you about their craft where you just went, wow, I've never tried that, or I think I will?
Lots of things.
Things you learned.
Interesting. So the Writer's Room is a collection of interviews that I did for a little sort of made-up magazine that I called grandly a digital magazine that was basically a PDF file. And had, a few very nice, loyal subscribers for 3 years, and I did an interview every 2 months. But the time of producing these interviews pretty much exactly mapped the time that I was writing The Natural Way of Things. So it was kind of like every 2 months I'd go, how do you do it?
Help me.
So lots of things really changed my book, actually, because of that. And one of them that I remember very early on, because it was Amanda Laurie, who's a brilliant writer, Australian writer. And she said, I always like a book to have some sort of messages from another realm, is the way she described it, some sort of presence beyond the surface. And that suddenly opened up for me that my book didn't have to be a realist, written in a realist, naturalistic style, that it could start to become more surreal and more imaginative in a way that was much more interesting for me to write, and also allowed me into the material in a way that could be coped with. And I think the same of your writing, Eimear. The style and the language is everything in allowing you to go into that material that's so vivid and alive, but it's because of the way you do it, Anyway, that's just one example, but there are many.
And do you have any writing rules, Eimear? Can you share your craft? I mean, I've read that you wrote 1,000 words a day. Is that something you actually think helps you?
Again, when I started writing Girl, I didn't know how to write a book, and I just thought, well, I'll write 1,000 words a day and something will happen. And something did. So there you go, you just got to put it in. But every day I would reread the 1,000 words and then cut about 850 words and start from the most interesting sentence, and when it came to writing The Lesser Bohemians, that was how I did it again. And it just took a lot longer. I mean, this was 6 months and that was 9 years. So
really, 9 years?
9 years to write it.
So even when Eimear, it took a while to find a publisher.
It also took 9 years to find a publisher.
For the first book.
Yeah.
So even when you had this unpublished manuscript somewhere, which occasionally you would dust off, and you could keep writing.
Yeah, well, I didn't write for about 3 years after, and then I basically had to decide what I was, and whether if being a failed writer still meant that I was a writer, and unfortunately for my life and self-esteem, I was still a writer despite the failure, and so I just started to write the second book.
So can you tell us something about The Lesser Bohemians, and would you do us the honour of reading a section as well?
I would very happily read from this book. It is different. It's very different to Girl. Girl is a book about despair, and I wanted to write a book about joy. And it is not entirely about joy, but there is some joy in it. And it's a love story, and it's between an 18-year-old girl who goes to London to go to drama school, and she meets a 38-year-old actor, and they begin a relationship. And so it's about that, and it's also a kind of love letter to London in the 1990s. Okay. So I will read a little bit, which is, he's about to take her home for the first time. She's dying to lose her virginity. He's up for that, although he doesn't know it yet. To flickering lights, shouts of time. How was the chatting up in the end? Pretty good, well done. Thanks, he smiles. Good enough to warrant taking me home. Here it is then, here I am. Oh God, I would, but I'm up in Kentish Town in this bed sitting my landlady. Oh, right, never mind. Sorry, I'm sorry. Don't worry, it's fine. No, it's the truth. It's not that I wouldn't like to, I just... Okay. So come back to mine. Oh, nearby, is it? Ask like distance is the thing. Yeah, 5 minutes up the road. I feign indecision, but he is so easy in the wait, like he already knows. All right, I say. All right then, he says. Come on, get your coat.
So good.
That's too hard an act for me to follow, so I'm now going to ask you to follow it. Do we have any questions from the audience? Raise your hand, and I think there's mics coming down. We have one here, which, before the mic arrives, said, and I will repeat it. The question was, are you going to release that on audiobook, The Lesser Bohemians?
Yes, I am. I did the audiobook for Girls Have From Thing, and I've just finished recording Lesser Bohemians, so I think it is out in November, probably on audio.
Other questions? There's another one down here at the front. Here comes the mic. No, well, I can hear you, but here you go.
Thank you. Thank you both for your books, which are absolutely riveting and will stay in the mind for a long time. I did have a question for Charlotte. Maybe a trivial question, but it bothered me. when the girls are apparently being rescued in the
Okay, can I
bus.
just quickly say,
No spoilers.
I will happily answer your question. We have to be very careful about spoiling the ending for people who haven't read it, because I have seen audiences get very
Okay.
angry.
Well, if you don't want to answer it, just don't answer it.
Okay,
Okay.
just don't give it
It's a
away.
very small point, but it bothered me that they're all not noticing because they're very excited, and you say they didn't notice that the bus turned west instead of east. And you don't say anything else about that. Maybe you can't answer it, but
I won't. I'm very happy to talk about it afterwards if you
Okay.
like. Yeah. I just think it's giving too much away.
all right, thank you.
There's a question right behind you. If we could pass the mic backwards, thank you.
Thank you so much, all three of you, for a really wonderful discussion. I had this question actually for Eimear after your session this morning. Didn't get time to ask it, but it's a perfect question to ask to both of you guys.
Okay.
I'm really interested to know what is so intriguing about girlhood as a kind of a space or an identity to explore in your work.
Well, I think for me, writing about, that both books, although Girl is a Half-Formed Thing goes from the womb up to 20, the girl in Lesser Bohemians is 18. I think that point in girlhood is incredibly interesting to me, because it's the point when you start to become who you will be as an adult. You start making all the ridiculous decisions that you don't understand the consequences of, but that will inform who you will become. And I obviously know a lot about that, having once been an 18-year-old girl, so the girlhood bit sort of comes along with it. For me, it's about that age that's kind of important and interesting.
My answer is probably similar about the time. I mean, obviously mine was sparked by the real young women in Hay, but that period of time where you don't know who you are yet, I think, and you also don't know perhaps how subject you are to the forces of the world acting upon you. And I think that for the girls in my book, that is the case, where they are basically plunged into a state of absolute shock that this could happen to them, because they were just being themselves, they thought, but they didn't understand how much their being themselves was threatening to a larger society. So, and that's what they kind of come to learn, how dangerous they are. So they kind of had to be that age, I think. Thank you.
Probably got time for one or two more questions. Is there another one at the front? I'm not discriminating against the back, but there is.
There's one halfway up
There's
there.
one there. Maybe we'll take that one and then this one, and then we might have to stop. Otherwise, I'll have to ask authors their least favourite question, which is, what are you working on now?
Quick, let's get to the questions.
My question's for Charlotte. I haven't finished the other book yet, sorry, so I don't have a question for that one. But my question, one of the things I really liked about the book was how much was taken from real life. Like the example of, what did you think? You're just going home for a cup of Milo. Like there was key things from that sayings that we'd know from real life. But another aspect was that often the decisions characters made didn't seem to directly correlate with decisions I guess people do make in real life. And what I liked about that was it made me think, I guess, about, well, what's the point that you're trying to make here? But I wondered if you were consciously trying to have a point with every decision the characters made, whether you had a reference point to real things that happened.
Do you mean decisions before they ended up here or while they were there?
I know why they're in the camp or the prison.
I don't think I had any real points of reference, but of course you're right about the language. A lot of the language used in the book is taken directly from real world events. So there was a young woman who was involved with, in a sexual assault with a bunch of footballers, and one of the commentators was, well, what did she think she was there for? A cup of Milo, which is a chocolate drink.
And
so
the Diane
those,
Brimble case, where they just treat it like
And
That's some of
the Diane Brimble case woman was...
Yes.
Every time I think about that, I just feel with utter fury, left for dead and died in a cruise ship. And nothing happened to the perpetrators. So I wanted there to be these little slaps of our real contemporary world, that this place is sort of imagined and strange and, dystopian and weird, and that every now and again the reader who's in touch with the news of the day could feel a little slap of recognition of, the language used about women in the book is language that we have all heard. Big red box, which was the phrase used about our Prime Minister on a hilarious Liberal Party menu. So those things, I wanted there to be a sort of an arrow from the real world into the book. But I guess in terms, back to your question about their decisions in the book, once the girls were in the book, they bore no relation to any of those real things. They were just my imagined girls, and they were behaving in the way that I thought their characters would in the scenario.
We've probably got time just for one more, if you still would like to ask it, just this final question down the front. Sorry, I think this poor man worked very hard there.
This is also a question for Charlotte. I really loved the book, and one part that I found really empowering was one of the characters' kind of journey towards and connection with nature, and that's what I kind of got out of the title. And I know you were talking a bit about the title, but that was something I found a really great connection with. But were you trying to make any commentary there around kind of that as being a form of women's empowerment, like Mother Earth, and that connection back to real primal kind of...
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes and no. So Yolanda, one of the main characters, she basically becomes an animal, and she starts trapping rabbits, and then she starts dressing in rabbit skins, and so not so much the Mother Earth thing, although I'm sure that is there, but more the wildness and the Yolanda has always been a very beautiful, beautiful child and beautiful young woman, and sort of has, in the course of the book, understands that womanliness is what has trapped her. And I'm not saying that this traps everybody, but for her, that basically divesting of her human self and becoming wilder and wilder is how she becomes stronger and stronger. So, it's not a suggestion that we all have to go and live in the bush and live in rabbit burrows, but for her, I wanted a situation where she should have been becoming weaker and weaker. She was becoming stronger and stronger, and it was connecting herself with a deeper natural world that empowers her.
Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful question. Thank you for being a fabulous audience. If you like the work that Stella Prize does, please consider making a donation to the prize, and please join me in thanking these incredible authors for their books and that today.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.